The cobblestones still held the blood. Not in any obvious way. The rain and the sweep of brooms had seen to that over the past 3 weeks. But Thomas Mercer could feel it in how his shoes caught slightly on certain stones as he walked, as if the earth itself remembered. What had soaked into it, what horrors had transpired on this ground when the dying was at its absolute worst. He stood at the edge of the marketplace as dawn broke over the rooftops of Bristol, watching the light creep across the empty square like a hesitant hand reaching into a tomb that had not yet given up all its secrets. It was March again. Another spring. The kind of morning that should have felt like rebirth, like the world shaking itself awake after winter's long sleep, stretching its limbs and preparing to grow again. Instead, it felt like standing in a tomb. The sun rose higher, painting the wooden stalls in shades of amber and gold, and Thomas felt the weight of those colors against his chest like stones pressing down on his heart, like the weight of all the dead people pressing down on the city itself. This was the first market day after the Black Death had finally released its grip on the city. Not that death had completely stopped, of course. Death never stopped. People were still dying. The plague had retreated, but it hadn't vanished entirely, hadn't disappeared like morning fog under the warmth of the sun. There were still cases of a woman here, a child there, an old man in another neighborhood, but the overwhelming tide had broken. The terrifying sense that everyone in the city was on borrowed time, that death was indiscriminate and merciless, and could come for you at any moment without warning, without mercy, without any rhyme or reason, had shifted into something more like the normal human awareness of mortality that people had lived with for centuries before the plague had come. Still present, still omnipresent, but no longer quite so immediate and consuming. Still omnipresent, but at least now there was the sense that you might be able to plan for tomorrow, that tomorrow might actually arrive. The city was trying to wake up, and that process was painful and strange and filled with a kind of desperate hope that felt almost unbearable. Thomas adjusted the rope across his chest, where his canvas sacks hung, heavy with the winter stores his family had managed to keep for trading. Inside the sacks were turnips, some dried herbs that his wife Margaret had gathered and preserved back in the autumn before the plague had come in its full fury, a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, 6 eggs in a bed of straw that he had carefully carried to the marketplace, and a bolt of coarse linen that Margaret had woven in the dark months when she had used her hands to create rather than to bury or tend to the sick or sit in helpless vigil over the dying. These were the riches of the Mercer household, not much for a family of 8 that had dwindled to 5 through death, but enough. Enough to bring to market. Enough to test whether the world still operated on the simple principle that goods could be exchanged for coin, for other goods, for survival. Enough to see if the marketplace itself still functioned as a marketplace, or whether it had become something else entirely, a haunted space, perhaps a monument to what commerce had been before the world had been remade by pestilence. He wasn't sure anymore if that principle held. He wasn't sure if anything held anymore. The principles that had governed the world his entire life, the hierarchy of the church, the authority of the king, the predictability of seasons and harvests, the notion that if you worked hard and followed the rules and lived a moral life, you would be rewarded with continuity and relative security. All of these had been revealed to be fragile propositions, mere illusions held up by habit and faith in the face of plague. A merchant who had spent 40 years accumulating wealth and property could die in the space of a week, his goods seized by the state, his property passing to his children, who might themselves be dead within a fortnight. A young woman in the prime of her life could be married on Monday and widowed and buried by Friday. Children could vanish. Whole families could be obliterated in the time it took for the season to change. The world had revealed itself to be fundamentally unstable. The marketplace looked smaller than he remembered it, though he had been here not that long ago, perhaps 4 months prior, back in November, before the worst of the dying had begun in earnest, before the plague had settled over the city like a suffocating blanket. Not in physical dimension, the square was still the same sprawl of packed earth and weathered wooden stalls that had anchored commercial life in Bristol for 2 generations, perhaps longer. The marketplace had been here when his grandfather was a boy, when his grandfather's father had been a boy, probably. It would probably be here when his own children reached old age, assuming they survived to old age, which was no longer the guarantee it had once seemed to be. It would probably survive everyone he knew. The marketplace was older and would endure longer than any single person. No, the marketplace looked smaller because it was emptier. Where there should have been 30 vendors arranging their wares in the early morning light, moving with the familiar choreography of setting up for business, establishing their territories, preparing to do battle in the marketplace, there were perhaps 10, perhaps fewer. Where there should have been the roar and bustle of the crowd merchants shouting their wares, calling out their prices, goodwives, haggling over cost children running between tables dogs, fighting over scraps and thrown food, the sound of commerce, the sound of human activity and connection, there was something closer to silence. A sparse, hollow quiet that seemed to have weight and substance, as if the silence itself was a thing you could touch and feel and be crushed by. The silence was almost worse than the noise of death had been. Thomas recognized most of the vendors who had shown up to the marketplace this morning. There was old Willem the fishmonger, his face more lined than it had been before the plague, his skin hanging looser on his bones, his eyes carrying a kind of haunted quality that Thomas recognized from looking in the mirror at his own face. Willem was operating his stall alone now, instead of with his 3 sons who had worked that stall with him for years, learning the business, developing the skills necessary to select and price and display fish in the most appealing way. 3 sons. Willem had brought them into the business gradually, over the years, training them carefully in the particular skill of selecting fish, of knowing which fish were fresh and which were past their prime, of pricing them appropriately, to assure both that they sold and that he made a profit. He had trained them in how to negotiate with customers, how to read people, how to know when someone was trying to cheat you, and when someone was simply trying to get the best price they could. He had invested years into making these sons into merchants, into creating a legacy that would carry on after he died. Thomas did the mathematics without meaning to. 3 sons who had worked that stall meant 3 sons who had coughed blood and died in the space of a week back in November, when the plague had been at its absolute worst, when it had seemed like it would never stop, when people had begun to genuinely believe that everyone might die, that humanity itself might vanish from the earth, that God was perhaps cleansing the world of human beings and starting over. 3 sons who would never have the opportunity to inherit the stall, to carry on the work that their father had done, to train their own children in the business. 3 sons gone. The succession severed, the future cut off. Willem was moving very slowly as he arranged his stock this morning, selecting each fish with deliberate care, checking the eyes for clarity and the gills for appropriate color, ensuring that each fish was displayed to its best advantage. Thomas wondered if the old man was simply moving slowly because he was old, which he was, perhaps in his late 60s and bereaved, or whether the pestilence had left some mark on him that even survival couldn't erase. There was something methodical about his movements, something that suggested a man who was trying very hard to focus on the task at hand, because the moment he stopped focusing on the immediate task, the moment he allowed his mind to wander, the grief might overwhelm him completely. Thomas knew this feeling intimately. He had experienced it himself in the dark months when his own household had been touched by death, when 2 of his children, his youngest daughter Eleanor, who had been perhaps 8 years old, and one of his sons, William, who had been just turning 12, had sickened and died in a manner so swift that he could barely comprehend it now, looking back on it from the distance of spring. The fever had come on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Eleanor was dead. William lasted until Friday, but barely. Thomas had sat with their small bodies, waiting for the grave diggers to come, not fully able to believe that his children were gone, that the world could simply take them without his permission, without giving him any option but to accept it. There was Sarah the baker, her flour-dusted apron hanging loose on a frame that seemed to have shrunk, that seemed to have become smaller, as if grief was physically diminishing her. She had lost her daughter, Thomas knew. The girl had been perhaps 17, newly married just the year before, full of the particular kind of hope that came with a new marriage and a new household, and the prospect of children and a life stretching ahead. That had been back in February, when the dying was still going on, when it had seemed like it would never stop, when people had started to become almost numb to death, when the revelation of each new death had lost some of its power to shock and devastate. Sarah was arranging her loaves of bread with the same kind of careful attention that Willem was giving to his fish. The bread was fresh. Thomas could smell it. She must have been up since before dawn, baking in the dark, her hands working the dough with the muscle memory of decades of early mornings. She knew what she was doing. She knew how to make bread. She knew how to do this thing that had given her life meaning and structure for so long. And yet, everything was different now. Everything had changed. There was Marcus the clothier, who had been among the fortunate, if fortune was the right word for losing only one child instead of several, if fortune could be said to apply to any family touched by plague. Marcus had lost a daughter, or perhaps it was a son. Thomas tried to remember, but couldn't quite place it. His own capacity to retain the details of others' grief had been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of death, by the way that death had become so common, so frequent, that you could barely keep track of who had lost what. It all blended together into one great tide of loss and grief and devastation. Margaret had whispered to Thomas that Marcus's wife had taken ill in the latter stages of the plague, but had, miraculously, recovered. The word miraculously had been one that appeared frequently in conversations now, though Thomas wasn't sure it meant what people thought it meant. If it was truly a miracle that Marcus's wife had survived, then was it truly a miracle, or was it just chance? And if it was chance, then what did that say about all the people who had died? Were they meant to die? Had God chosen them for death? Had God turned his face away from them? Thomas had been raised Catholic. He had attended church regularly his entire life. He had believed, in a way, in the framework of Christian cosmology. But the plague had put a strain on that belief that Thomas wasn't sure his faith could sustain. The framework felt fragile now. It felt like it might break at any moment under the weight of all the questions. The marketplace was filling slowly as the morning progressed, not with the rush and surge that would normally have marked a market day, not with the press of humanity eager to trade, to gossip, to conduct the business that held the social sinews of a medieval town together. The marketplace had always been a social institution, not just an economic one. It was where news was exchanged, where rumors were born and spread, where the rhythms of civic life were established and maintained. People had come to market not just to buy and sell, but to be part of the collective life of the city. They had come to participate in something that was almost democratic in a sense, insofar as the marketplace was a space where a peasant might stand, next to a merchant, where a beggar might encounter a lady of quality, where the boundaries of hierarchy could be temporarily loosened in the service of commerce. Instead, people were arriving in small groups, often in family clusters, moving cautiously as if they were reluctant to come at all, but understood that they had to. The world had stopped for a season. Entire households had locked themselves in, trying to wait out the plague as if it was a storm that would eventually pass, that would blow itself out and move on to other places, leaving them unharmed. Some people had fled the cities entirely, seeking safety in the countryside or in smaller towns where the plague had not yet reached, or had reached less dramatically, less completely. Others had simply hidden, emerging only when necessary for food or water. The marketplace had been nearly empty for months. During the worst of it, people had been afraid to go out. They had been afraid of catching the pestilence from the air itself, or from looking at a sick person, or from contact with goods that had been touched by someone sick. Food shortages had developed in some places because the normal channels of commerce had broken down completely. The harvest had come in last autumn, but in many cases it had been harvested by people who were trying to stay as isolated as possible, or who had themselves died before the harvest could be properly brought in. Food had spoiled in storage. Prices had become unpredictable and volatile, swinging wildly from day to day depending on the availability of goods and the desperation of people. Some merchants had hoarded goods, creating artificial scarcity to drive prices higher. Others had given up entirely treating the plague as if it was a sign that the end of the world was coming, and therefore commerce was pointless at all there. Careful accumulation would mean nothing if God was wiping humanity from the face of the earth. Now, slowly, reluctantly, people were beginning to re-engage with the normal functions of life. The marketplace was opening again. People were bringing goods to sell. Buyers were returning, cautiously, testing whether it was safe, whether the danger had truly passed. The basic functions of human civilization, exchange, commerce, negotiation, were reasserting themselves. The fundamental drive of humans to engage in commerce, to trade with one another, to acquire and exchange goods, seemed to be something that couldn't be stopped even by plague. Thomas watched as a young woman arrived with a small boy clutching her skirt. She had the look of someone who had lost weight, not in the way that a person might lose weight from dieting, but in the way that a person loses weight from months of inadequate nutrition or from the strain of grief and stress and fear. Her face was thin, with a kind of hollow-cheeked look that suggested months of either actual starvation or the functional equivalent. Months of eating just enough to survive, but not enough to truly nourish herself. The boy was pale and thin, with that particular quality that malnourished children had, a kind of translucence, as if the ordinary solidity of human flesh had been replaced by something thinner and more fragile, more insubstantial. He might have been 5. He might have been 7. It was hard to tell with children. Now the plague had a way of aging them, hollowing them out, stripping away the softness that normally characterized childhood. The children who had survived had been marked by the experience. They had been changed in ways that probably wouldn't fully manifest until later in their lives. They had probably just gotten back to regular food, Thomas thought, watching the boy move carefully through the marketplace. That child was still catching up on calories that malnutrition and fear had stolen from him during the months when the plague was at its worst. You could see it in how he moved. There was a kind of hesitation, a lack of the normal exuberance that children usually brought to the marketplace. This child was not running around the marketplace excitedly, not darting between the stalls, not picking things up and asking his mother to buy them. This child was holding on to his mother's skirt as if his life depended on it, as if letting go might result in disaster, as if his mother might disappear if he didn't maintain physical contact with her. Thomas had seen many such children in the marketplace in previous years, though in most cases they had been children of the very poor, the children of beggars and laborers and people on the margins of society. Now he was seeing it more commonly. It was a sight that made him uncomfortable, because it was a sight that suggested that the plague had created a kind of general poverty that touched even people who had not been poor before. This woman's dress suggested she had been, before the plague, a person of at least some substance. She was wearing clothes that were well made, even if they were now thin and somewhat worn. The boy's clothes suggested the same thing. They were people who had lost status, or at least had lost the ability to maintain the material appearance of their previous status. The plague had not only killed people, it had impoverished the survivors. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The smell hit Thomas as he moved deeper into the marketplace, exactly as it always did, though his nose had perhaps become more sensitive to it over the plague months, more attuned to the particular odors that characterized a marketplace. It was a familiar smell, the ordinary commerce of a market day, but sharper, more acrid than he remembered it being. He recognized the fish, the bread, the animal dung and dust that always rose from the earth on a busy day. The smell of humanity concentrated in one space. The smell of food being bought and sold. The smell of commerce itself, which was a kind of olfactory record of all the transactions that had ever happened here, all the haggling and negotiating and exchanging of coin for goods that had transpired in this square over decades and probably centuries. But underneath it was something else. A faint sourness that might have been just the smell of a city that had been dying, a collective exhalation of grief and fear and human waste that had soaked into the very stones of the marketplace, into the wood of the stalls, into the earth itself. The plague had a smell, Thomas had learned, during the worst months. In the worst months, when death was happening at such scale that you could barely comprehend it, when people were dying faster than they could be buried, when the normal processes of grief and funerary care had completely broken down, the city itself had taken on a particular odor, a mixture of sickness and decay and human desperation that had seemed almost tangible, as if you could breathe it into your lungs and taste it on your tongue. Thomas Mercer. A voice called out, and Thomas turned to see John Carver, the cloth merchant, waving him over. John's stall still had its full array of fabrics, linens, and wools in various states of finish, from raw fibers to fine, finished cloth that was probably intended for the wardrobes of wealthy merchants or nobles. The stall looked much like it had before the plague, which was itself remarkable. So much had changed. So many stalls had been abandoned or dismantled. So many merchants had died or fled, or simply lost the will to continue, lost the sense that commerce mattered anymore. But John's stall was full, almost defiantly full, as if John was determined to insist through sheer force of merchandise that the world had not changed. Fundamentally, that commerce was still possible, that merchants still had a role to play. John himself looked almost healthy, and Thomas realized with a small jolt that John's entire household must have survived. That was rare enough to be noteworthy. Very few families had lost no one. The Carver family had been lucky, or perhaps they had been careful in ways that had paid off. John was a cautious man by nature. He made his fortune slowly, steadily, through careful negotiation and a kind of miserly attention to detail. Perhaps those same qualities had allowed him to protect his household. Perhaps he had kept them isolated when the plague was at its worst. Perhaps he had had the resources to buy better food, better shelter, better conditions that had somehow protected them while others around them were dying. Wealth had often provided some buffer against death, though not always. Some of the wealthiest people in the city had died, but having resources certainly didn't hurt. Thomas made his way over, his feet finding their practiced route through the marketplace. How strange it was to find the roots still there, the muscle memory of movement still intact. He had walked the same path hundreds of times in his life, from the moment his father had first brought him to market as a small boy of perhaps 5 or 6. His father had wanted to teach him the business of commerce, how to negotiate, how to recognize quality, how to move through the marketplace with the confidence of someone who belonged there, who knew what he was doing. The pandemic hadn't erased the paths. The world was still the same world, at least in its physical geography. The marketplace still occupied the same space. The streets still connected it to the harbor and the other parts of the city. But something fundamental had shifted in the nature of the space itself, in what it meant to walk these paths now. The marketplace was the same, but it was also different. It was haunted now, in a way. "I wondered if you'd come," John said, reaching out to clap Thomas on the shoulder. It was a gesture that, in normal times, would have been perfectly friendly. and casual, the kind of gesture that merchants made to each other constantly, a mark of fellowship and camaraderie. Now it seemed almost aggressive, the casual touching that still presumed immunity, or safety, or forgiveness. The gesture seemed to be saying, "I survived. I am healthy. I am not a risk. You can touch me safely." It was a claim that Thomas flinched slightly at, then caught himself and tried to smile. The old courtesies were still operative, he reminded himself. The plague was supposed to be over. It was supposed to be safe to touch each other now. Though the memory of that prohibition, a very real fear people had felt about contact, about proximity, about the dangerous closeness of human bodies to human bodies, seemed to linger. Even now, even after the worst had passed, that fear hadn't entirely vanished. It probably wouldn't vanish for a long time. "Had to," Thomas said. "Can't let the stores just sit. The family has to eat." "Yes," John said, and something flickered across his face. Not judgment, exactly, but awareness. A kind of recognition that they were all thinking the same thing. Who is left to feed? The plague had so thoroughly restructured the basic unit of family and household that this question was now always present, always relevant. You looked at a person and you wondered, who do they have left? How many children survived? What about parents? Siblings? Servants? The entire domestic structure had been altered. Households that had been large were now small. Some were nearly empty. John's own household had been large before the plague. Thomas had known him to employ several servants and to have a wife and perhaps 4 or 5 children. If he had lost even one person, that would still be remarkable. If he had lost none, then he was extraordinarily fortunate in a way that most people were not. "I've got good cloth. Just got a shipment in from the Cotswolds 3 days ago. Some of the weavers up there say they're behind schedule-lost workers. You understand, but the quality is there." John gestured to the various bolts of cloth at his stall, presenting them with the particular pride of a merchant who knew he had good merchandise, who understood the value of what he was offering. The cloth did look good, the weaves were tight, and even the colors were vibrant and well set, and the variety suggested that the production had not been unduly disrupted by the plague, or at least that some production was still happening, that some level of normalcy had been maintained in the Cotswolds. Thomas nodded, studying the fabrics carefully. He wasn't really interested in buying cloth today. He had brought cloth to sell, in fact, or at least linen that Margaret had woven during the long winter months when she hadn't been tending to the sick or burying the dead. But this was how you moved through the market. This was how you engaged in the social fiction, that the world was functioning normally, that the basic institutions of commerce were still operational, that people were still interested in accumulating goods and wealth rather than simply focused on immediate survival. You asked about goods. You examined things you might not want. You negotiated. You performed the role of a person who had a future that extended beyond today, a future that involved needs beyond food and shelter, a future that included desire for things, that included the belief that there would be a tomorrow worth preparing for. "How much for the linen?" Thomas asked, more to keep the conversation going than from any real desire to purchase. The finest linen that John had displayed looked like quality work. It was the kind of cloth that would have been used for the shirts and chemises of wealthy merchants' wives, or perhaps for the vestments of priests. It was not the kind of cloth that Thomas would normally be able to afford, nor the kind he would have had a use for. But asking about it was a way of demonstrating to John that he still understood the marketplace, that he still understood how to be a merchant, that the plague had not entirely destroyed his capacity to engage in this ancient dance of commerce. John named a price that was higher than Thomas would have expected. It was considerably higher than the prices that had been charged before the plague. Thomas felt a small surge of something, indignation maybe, or the old familiar frustration of trying to make a living in a world that never seemed to make it easy for a person of ordinary means. He had always struggled to accumulate wealth, always felt squeezed by prices, always sensed that the odds were somehow stacked against people like him. But he understood, too. Everything was scarce now. Labor was scarce because so many workers had died. Goods were scarce because production had been disrupted. Transportation was scarce because the people who did the transporting were either dead or reluctant to travel, afraid of encountering plague on the roads. The supply chains that had existed before the plague, the careful networks of merchants and traders that connected various towns and cities and allowed goods to flow from producer to consumer, had been severely disrupted. In some cases, entire populations of artisans had been wiped out. The weavers of the Cotswolds had been working with reduced staff, which meant reduced production, which meant scarcity, which meant higher prices. "I might come back," Thomas said. "If business goes well today." "It will," John said, with a confidence that seemed unwarranted given the generally reduced state of the marketplace. People need things. People always need things. The plague stopped a lot of things, but it didn't stop people needing cloth and food and the 1,000 small goods that keep us going. "I think you'll find the business is there. It's just ... different. The people who do the buying and selling, they're a different set now." This landed like a stone dropped into water. A different set. Yes, of course. The dead weren't buying anything. The dead weren't selling. The people who had built fortunes before the plague, the merchants who had accumulated property and goods through decades of careful trading, who had become wealthy enough to be notable figures in the city, who had perhaps served as guild leaders or held positions in the local government. Some of them were dead. Some of them had fled to smaller towns or the countryside, seeking safety or seeking a fresh start. Some were still here, but fundamentally changed, hollowed out, less interested in accumulation and more interested in simply surviving from one day to the next. The social fabric that had bound the marketplace together had been torn and was being painstakingly restitched, but the stitches were different now. The pattern was different. The marketplace was going to be a different kind of space now, whatever that meant. Thomas left John's stall and moved through the marketplace, taking in the scene with the particular attention of a man trying to make sense of a fundamentally altered landscape. He was trying to inventory what had changed and what had remained. It was a strange kind of archaeology, looking at a space that was still recognizable but fundamentally transformed. The marketplace was like a person he had known his entire life who had survived a terrible illness, still the same person in some ways, still occupying the same body and the same social role, but fundamentally changed by the experience of almost dying. He stopped at Willem's fish stall. The smell of the fish was strong a good sign, in a way. It meant the supply was fresh. It meant that despite everything, the fishing still happened. The boats still went out. The catches were still brought in. The harbor of Bristol was still functioning, at least to some degree. There were still fishing boats. There were still people willing to work them, even though the plague had killed so many that labor was scarce and dangerous. The fishermen had to face the same risks that everyone else faced, the risk of contamination, the risk of sickness, the risk of death. But there were apparently still men willing to take those risks, because the fishing had to be done, because people needed to eat, because even in the face of catastrophe, the basic functions of the city could not simply stop. "Mercer," Willem said, acknowledging him with a nod. The old man didn't smile, but then Willem rarely had smiled even before the plague. He was a man of economic disposition. He came to the market to work, not to socialize, not to enjoy the particular flavor of marketplace gossip and fellowship that many merchants seemed to relish. He was a serious man, perhaps too serious, though that seriousness had probably served him well in the plague months. It was easier to be serious when you were grieving, when you had lost 3 sons in the space of a week, when your entire planned future had been erased. "You here to trade?" Willem asked, continuing in his characteristic style of brevity and direct address. He didn't waste words. He didn't engage in unnecessary pleasantries. Possibly, Thomas said. What's your stock like? Is the supply still coming in regular? Willem gestured at the various fish laid out on his wooden counter, their scales catching the morning light, their eyes reflecting the sky. There were several varieties represented, some that Thomas recognized as dried cod that would have been preserved earlier in the season, some fresh fish of various kinds, some that he wasn't entirely sure about. The display was impressive, given that the plague had disrupted so much of the normal supply chains. Willem had apparently managed to maintain his connections to the fishing boats, or had perhaps worked out new arrangements with new fishermen, people who had perhaps lost their previous occupations and were looking for work, coming in fine. Lost a lot of my people who worked the dock. You know how it was. But the boats are still operating. Men are still willing to fish. Pays well enough if you don't mind the work. He paused, seemed to consider whether to say more, then continued, his voice dropping slightly as if he was sharing a kind of secret. The price of fish is up. Everything's up. Labor's scarce, goods are scarce. It's the way of things when half the people are gone. Half the people are gone. It was not an exaggeration, not in this city. The plague had swept through Bristol like divine fury, which was how many people were describing it, how the preachers were describing it in the churches. It was the judgment of God. It was the end times. It was the payment for the sins of man. It was nature's way of correcting the balance between population and resources. It was whatever theological or philosophical framework you wanted to apply to it. Thomas had heard all of this. He had, even in his darkest moments, believed some of it. It was hard not to believe that something catastrophic, something apocalyptic, was happening when you watched people die by the hundreds, when the graveyards became so full that they had to start digging mass pits, when the death carts came through the streets, calling for the bodies. Bring out your dead, bring out your dead, with a kind of grim cheerfulness that seemed almost obscene. The death carts had become familiar. The sound of them had become ordinary. The sight of corpses piled into carts had become something you saw and then looked away from because there was nothing you could do about it. The mathematics of it were terrible and had been endlessly discussed and debated in the months since the plague had come to Bristol. Before the plague came, the city had been a city of perhaps 40,000 souls. Thomas had heard estimates from those who supposedly knew such things, city officials, men who prided themselves on knowing the numbers, on understanding the scale of things, on maintaining records and accounts. Some of them had kept careful tallies as the plague progressed, trying to understand what was happening, trying to document the catastrophe. Now the estimates varied wildly, anywhere from 15,000 to 20,000 people left alive. That meant that perhaps 30,000 people had died. 30,000 people. The number was so large as to be almost impossible to comprehend. 30,000 deaths in a city, spread over the course of just a few months. It was as if God had decided to depopulate the earth. It was as if the plague was a kind of divine reset, wiping the slate clean. Some people said it was even worse than that whole villages in the countryside had been nearly wiped out, that in some places you could ride for miles and see nothing but empty houses and abandoned fields and animals that had gone feral because there was no one left to tend them. The cities had been hardest hit. The crowding, the filth, the proximity of bodies in markets, and churches and homes, all of it had made the plague spread like flame through dry wood. In a small town, you could survive the plague by isolating yourself, by refusing contact with other people. In a city, isolation was almost impossible. You were surrounded by other people. You could not escape them. You had to buy food somewhere. You had to do business. You had to interact. And in those interactions, the plague spread. The price of things will stay high for a while, Willem continued, perhaps taking Thomas's silence for interest in this economic analysis. Or at least, that's what I figure. Eventually, though, things will normalize. When we get back to a balance, when people start breeding again, and new people are coming into the world to replace those we lost. But that'll take time. Years, probably. Maybe a generation or more. Thomas heard the unspoken thought underneath this. We have lost so much time. We have lost so much, and we will never get it back. The people who died will not come back. The time we spent grieving, the time we spent hiding in our homes waiting for the plague to end, the time we spent burying the dead and dealing with the chaos of a city without governance or structure, the time is gone. We cannot recover it. We can only move forward into a future that will always forever be defined by the fact that the plague happened and changed everything. The future would be measured now in terms of before plague and after plague. That was the division that would structure all history now. He purchased some dried fish enough for one good meal for the family, though it would cost him a coin that he had been hoping to keep. Coins were precious now. They represented a kind of concentrated value that was increasingly hard to justify. What was a coin worth when the supply chain that had existed before the plague had been so disrupted? A coin would buy you fish or bread or cloth, yes, but the prices were so volatile, so dependent on scarcity and the particular state of the marketplace on any given day, that coins felt slightly unreal now. They felt like they were backed by something that no longer existed, but this was the marketplace. This was how it worked. You had to spend coin to make coin. You had to engage in the simple transactions that kept the world turning, or at least that kept the world in the condition of trying to turn. As he moved deeper into the marketplace, Thomas began to notice something strange about the way people were interacting with each other. The haggling that normally marked market day, the back-and-forth negotiation that could get heated, competitive, even angry, seemed muted. People were still negotiating, still trying to get good prices for their purchases, but there was something softer about it, a kind of deference, or perhaps just exhaustion. The energy required for real negotiation, for aggressive haggling, for the kind of intense commerce that normally characterized a busy marketplace, seemed to have been drained out of people. Or perhaps the plague had created a sense of fellowship among the survivors that made people reluctant to engage in the aggressive competition of commerce. If you had both survived the plague, if you were both still alive while so many others had died, then how could you justify trying to cheat each other over the price of a loaf of bread? At Sarah, the baker's stall, he noticed this most clearly. It was now mid-morning, and Sarah had already sold quite a bit of her bread. The stall was less full than it had been when Thomas had arrived at the marketplace an hour or so earlier. A woman Thomas didn't recognize, a woman who looked to be perhaps in her 40s, with a kind of worn appearance that suggested she had also been touched by the plague, had also lost people, was trying to purchase a loaf of bread from what remained of Sarah's stock. Sarah was asking for a price that the woman clearly found excessive. You could see it in the woman's face, the slight tightening of her expression, the way her hand hesitated before reaching into her purse to see how much coin she actually had. "I can get bread from the baker on Corn Street for half that," the woman said, but there was no heat in her voice, no anger, just a statement of fact, the way you might mention the weather or comment on the color of the sky. It was observation rather than complaint. It was information being shared rather than a negotiating tactic. "You can," Sarah agreed, her voice calm and almost resigned. She wasn't defensive about her pricing. "If he's still there." "I haven't seen him in more than a month. His wife died, you probably knew that, and he closed up shop. I think he went to live with his daughter somewhere in Gloucestershire. But if you want to go hunting for another baker, I certainly won't stop you." The woman looked away, seemed to make a calculation. She was presumably trying to decide whether it was worth her time to go searching for another baker, or whether it was better to simply accept Sarah's price. The economics of effort were different now. With so much excess capacity in the city, so many empty houses, so many plots of land that had no one to work them, you could theoretically go anywhere. You could find alternative sellers. But finding them took time and effort, and time and effort themselves were now more valuable than they had been before, because every moment spent searching was a moment not spent doing other things, and there was so much work to be done now in the aftermath of the plague. There were houses that needed to be cleaned out. There were gardens that needed to be planted. There were 1,000 pressing tasks that demanded attention. Standing in the marketplace arguing over the price of bread was a luxury that few people seemed to have the energy for anymore. "What's the bread like?" the woman asked finally. "Fresh?" "Baked this morning," Sarah said. "I baked it before dawn." "It's good bread. It's what I've always made." "You can taste the difference between good bread and bad bread." The woman nodded, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps. The woman reached into a small purse at her waist and handed over the coin that Sarah had asked for. She took the bread without further negotiation. She examined it carefully, noting the crust, breaking off a small piece and tasting it. Then, apparently satisfied, she wrapped it carefully in cloth and moved on. Thomas understood what was happening here. The old rules of commerce were being enforced by scarcity and exhaustion rather than by law or custom. You paid what the merchant asked because you were tired, because there might not be another option, because it was easier to accept it than to protest. Also, and Thomas felt this deeply, because you understood in a new way that everything was provisional. A baker could disappear, a market could vanish. A way of life that had seemed permanent could be revealed to be made of gossamer, held together only by the fact that enough people kept showing up to pretend it was solid. If you wanted to preserve the marketplace, if you wanted to maintain the basic functions of commerce, then you had to accept the prices that merchants were asking, because driving merchants out of business through aggressive haggling would only further reduce the supply of goods available. The merchant was not your enemy anymore. The merchant was keeping something alive, the structure of civilization, the pretense that the world still worked, the idea that exchange and commerce and the basic functions of trade could still operate. The morning continued. Thomas moved through the marketplace, stopping at various stalls, examining goods, making trades. He exchanged his turnips to a woman who was clearly trying to rebuild her household after the plague had taken her family. She bought them eagerly, paying a good price because she understood their value in a diet that had been severely restricted for months. He traded his wheel of cheese to an older man who reminded him of his own father, a man whose face had the particular look of someone who had survived, but who wasn't entirely sure why he had survived when others around him had died. The cheese was good. Thomas could tell that the man recognized its quality, and they negotiated for a few minutes before settling on a price that satisfied them both. The bolt of linen that Margaret had woven moved slowly. That was disappointing, but not entirely surprising. Cloth was plentiful in a world where people had stopped wearing clothes in the usual way, or at least where wardrobes had become less important than they had been before. The great households that had employed seamstresses and maintained extensive wardrobes had been decimated. Many of the women who had done fine needlework were dead. Many of the merchants who had sold cloth for fine garments were dead or had fled. Meanwhile, the wardrobes of the dead had flooded the market with used and sometimes barely used clothing. You could buy a dead person as dress for almost nothing if you were willing to overlook the slight stain or the faint smell that lingered in the fabric. So selling new cloth was hard. Eventually, though, a woman purchased Margaret's linen at a price that was lower than Thomas would have liked, but higher than he had expected. The woman seemed satisfied with the purchase, examining the linen carefully, and noting that the weave was tight and that the color was good, that the dye had taken well and wouldn't fade quickly. By midday, Thomas's canvas sacks were significantly lighter. They no longer held the bulk of goods that they had when he had arrived at the marketplace in the early morning. Instead, they held something different, a collection of goods that he had received in trade, along with a small amount of coin. He had also accumulated some barter goods that he could trade back in his neighborhood for things his family needed. He was doing well, he thought, better than expected. It had been a real concern that the marketplace would not function, that people would simply hoard what goods they had, that there would be no commerce, and therefore no opportunity to trade for the things that a family needed to survive. But it seemed that even in this diminished world, people still needed things. They still wanted things. Desire hadn't been killed by the plague, only reshaped. Around midday, a commotion arose at the edge of the marketplace. Thomas turned to see a group of men arriving on horseback, wealthy men, clearly, judging by their horses and their clothes. The horses were well fed and well maintained, which was itself remarkable given the general state of the city. One of the men was wearing a surcoat with the arms of a local merchant guild embroidered in gold thread. Another wore the insignia of the Cloth Workers' Guild. They were moving through the marketplace with a kind of official purpose, stopping at various stalls, apparently taking stock of what was being sold and in what quantities. They were speaking with individual merchants, examining goods, looking at accounting records that some merchants had apparently brought with them. Guild inspectors, a man standing near Thomas said quietly. He was a vendor whom Thomas recognized vaguely as someone who worked in leather-making belts and shoes and other leather goods. His name was Peter, Thomas thought, or perhaps Paul. The man had survived the plague, which was remarkable because leather workers often worked in close quarters with each other, in workshops where the proximity made disease spread quickly. Probably want to make sure people aren't gouging on prices, though God knows how they'll enforce it. Thomas watched as the men went from stall to stall. He saw John Carver speaking with one of them, saw the inspector examine some of the cloth, carefully saw them negotiate something, a price presumably, or perhaps a tax or a fee that merchants were supposed to pay to the guild. The world was trying to re-establish its structures. The plague had torn things apart, but humans were creatures of habit. They wanted hierarchy, they wanted order, they wanted rules. They wanted the comfort of knowing that there was some authority directing things, even if that authority had proven, in the face of plague, to be utterly powerless against the forces of death and disease. This was not necessarily a comfort, Thomas thought. The rules had done nothing to stop the plague. All the authority of the church, all the power of the king, all the structure and hierarchy that society had built over centuries, none of it had prevented God, or fate, or nature, or whatever you wanted to call it, from essentially reshuffling the deck of human beings and deciding who lived and who died. The bishop had maintained public order and moral authority right up until he died of plague himself. The king had issued proclamations and maintained court procedures right up until the plague spread to the royal household. Structure and hierarchy and authority had all been revealed to be somewhat illusory in the face of forces beyond human control. But perhaps that was exactly why people needed the rules now. If everything was chaos, if life was random and death was random, and nothing made sense, then at least the rules provided an illusion of order. At least they created the pretense that the world could be managed, that it could be understood, that there was some rationality to existence. And humans, Thomas had come to believe through the plague months, needed that illusion more than they needed reality. They needed to pretend that the world operated according to rational principles, even when those principles had been so thoroughly disproven. The inspectors moved through the marketplace methodically. They didn't seem threatening exactly, but they carried an authority with them. People spoke to them respectfully. Merchants answered their questions. Prices were discussed. At one point, Thomas heard one of the inspectors say something about maintaining fair prices so that the poor would not be exploited. The words seemed almost absurd. Fair prices? Poor people? Those categories had become almost meaningless. Everyone was poor now compared to before. Everyone had been reduced. The plague had created a kind of universal poverty, or at least a universal reduction in circumstances. By early afternoon, the inspectors had made their way through the marketplace and departed on their horses. The marketplace settled back into its strange, muted version of commerce. People continued to buy and sell. Merchants continued to display their wares. The fundamental functions of the marketplace continued, even without the official oversight. Thomas decided it was time to start thinking about leaving. He had done good business. He had purchased enough fish to provide a decent meal for his family. He had exchanged his vegetables and cheese for items that could be used or traded further. He had managed to sell Margaret's linen, albeit at a lower price than he would have liked. He had accumulated some coin and some goods. It had been a successful day by the standards of these new times. But before he left, he noticed something that caused him to pause. There was a figure standing alone at the far edge of the marketplace, watching the proceedings from a distance. It was an old woman. Thomas recognized her vaguely, or thought he did. She had been a moneylender before the plague, he thought. She had worked out of a small shop near the harbor, one of those narrow buildings that lined the streets near the water. She had been known among the merchants as someone who could be relied upon for a loan at a reasonable rate for a woman, which was saying something because most moneylenders were men and most of them charged rates that were outrageous and exploitative. Usury was technically prohibited by the church, of course, but everyone knew it happened anyway. The church made rules and people found ways around them. They always did. The old woman's name was Eleanor, Thomas thought. Or perhaps it was Elspeth. He wasn't entirely sure. She had been a fixture in the harbor area for as long as Thomas could remember, a presence in the economic structures that allowed merchants to operate and borrow and expand their operations through credit. She had been one of those people who existed in the shadows of the economy, not quite respectable, but absolutely necessary. What struck Thomas about this woman was her absolute stillness. She was not moving through the marketplace. She was not participating in any transactions. She was not examining goods or speaking to merchants or engaging in any of the normal activities that characterized a marketplace. She was simply standing and watching with an expression of such profound alienation that Thomas felt his stomach tighten. She looked like someone who had been severed from the world. Her clothes were fine, certainly finer than most of what Thomas saw around him, which suggested that money had protected her, that she had survived the plague. Wealth often provided some buffer against death. Those with resources could isolate themselves better. They could afford better food. They could avoid the crowded quarters where plague spread fastest. They could hire people to do errands, reducing their need to venture out into public spaces. But her face was the face of someone who had experienced such a fundamental shattering of the world that the physical appearance of normalcy could not convince her to believe in it. She looked like a ghost, or like someone who had only recently become aware that they themselves had died, or at least that their previous life had died. Her expression was blank, almost vacant. She was looking at the marketplace, yes, but she didn't seem to be seeing it, not really. She seemed to be looking through it, or past it, or at some other version of the marketplace that only she could perceive. Thomas found himself wondering what she had lost. A family member? Several? All of them? Or was it something else? Was it the loss of whatever had driven her before? The accumulation of money? The power that came with being a moneylender? The structure of a life built around calculation and interest and profit? The entire scaffolding of her identity had been built on one thing: the lending of money and the collection of interest. She had provided a service that was essential in a merchant economy. She had made herself indispensable. She had built a position of some power and influence, all based on the principle that people needed credit and would pay for it. But now, in a world where half the people were dead, where the basic scarcity of humanity had made coin less meaningful, where people were thinking about feeding their families first and enrichment second, what was the value of being a moneylender? What had happened to the careful accumulations of a lifetime, the capital and interest and leverage that had structured her existence? Were people still borrowing? Or were they too exhausted, too frightened, too focused on immediate survival to think about loans and future obligations? The old woman felt Thomas's gaze on her and turned to look at him. For a moment, their eyes met. Thomas saw something in her expression that he couldn't quite name. It was loss, certainly. But it was also something else. It was the look of someone who was trying to figure out who they were, now that their entire identity had been predicated on systems that might no longer hold. The plague had not just killed people. It had killed versions of the world. It had revealed systems that seemed permanent to be actually fragile. It had shown what happened when the certainty that characterized a life was suddenly proving to be uncertainty dressed up in old clothes. But he also thought about something else. He thought about the fact that the marketplace had opened, yes, but that it was vastly diminished. He thought about the fact that the supply chains that had once connected Bristol to the wider world were damaged and incomplete. He thought about the fact that prices were unstable and unpredictable. He thought about the fact that some entire categories of goods were now scarce or unavailable because the people who produced them had died. He thought about the fact that the world was fundamentally reorganizing itself around new principles that had not yet been articulated or understood. "Yes," he said finally, in response to Margaret's statement about figuring it out one day at a time. "I suppose we will." And outside, darkness fell on Bristol. The marketplace emptied as the vendors packed up their remaining goods and prepared to return to their homes or lodgings. The city settled into evening, one day closer to whatever came next, one day further from the worst of what had already come. The plague had taken so much, but it had left behind a world of survivors who were, against perhaps all odds, trying to believe that the basic structures of human existence, commerce, family, the exchange of goods, the possibility of a future, still held some meaning, that they could still be relied upon, that they still mattered. The first market day after the Black Death was over. Tomorrow there would be another day, and another after that. And slowly, gradually, the world would rebuild itself into something that might look like the world that had been before, though it would never be quite the same. The stones of the marketplace would be walked on again and again, worn smooth by the feet of thousands of people engaging in the ancient ritual of commerce. The merchants would return again tomorrow, and the day after that. The goods would be bought and sold. Life would continue. But something fundamental had shifted. Something about the certainty that had characterized the old world. The assurance that tomorrow would look like today, that the systems that held society together were eternal and immutable, that death was a fact of life but not something that would come for you in your crime, had been proven false. And that knowledge, that terrible, necessary knowledge, would shape everything that came next. It would reshape the marketplace. It would reshape the city. It would reshape the minds and hearts of everyone who had lived through it. The survivors would carry the plague with them, in their memories and in the way they thought about the future for the rest of their lives. It would be the defining event of their existence. Nothing would ever be quite as simple or as certain again. The marketplace stood empty in the darkness, the wooden stalls casting strange shadows in the moonlight. The stones had been walked on by thousands of feet over the course of the day. The stalls had been arranged and rearranged. Goods had been displayed and bought and sold. But underneath all of this, the stones still held the blood, or perhaps they were beginning to release it, to return it to the earth from which all things ultimately came. Time moved forward. The plague loosened its grip, and the survivors moved with it, building again, though not quite as before, establishing new patterns, creating new routines, trying to make sense of a world that made sense no longer. This was the first market day after the Black Death. There would be many more days to come. There would be market days in the spring and summer and fall. There would be market days when the vendors would number more than 10 and the crowds would grow larger. There would be market days when people would begin, slowly and carefully, to return to something like their old patterns of life. And there would be market days when the plague would return, as it did in subsequent waves, and death would come again, though not quite as catastrophically as it had come the first time. But this day, this first market day, after the worst of it had passed, this day was different. This day was the day when the world began to believe that it might survive. This day was the day when people came to market not just because they had to, not just because commerce was necessary for survival, but because they needed to confirm that normalcy was possible, that the world could go on, that life could go on. Thomas Mercer had come to market that day, carrying goods to trade. He had left carrying the knowledge that the marketplace still functioned, that people still wanted things, that exchange was still possible, that the basic structures of civilization, bent and warped by plague, could still hold together, that humans, even after experiencing such catastrophic loss, still had the capacity to engage in the mundane transactions that kept society functioning. He had also left carrying something else. He carried the memory of a young woman trying to remember how to cook, how to feed people, how to engage in the ordinary tasks of domesticity that the plague had made seem impossibly complicated. He carried the image of an old lender standing alone at the edge of the marketplace, severed from meaning, trying to understand what her life was now. He carried the understanding that the world had changed, fundamentally and perhaps permanently, and that all the survivors would have to learn to live in this new world, whatever it become. As night fell completely over the city, Thomas sat with Margaret, sharing the fish she had purchased, breaking the bread that they had at home, engaging in the simple ritual of eating together. They didn't speak much. There was nothing much to say. The meal itself was communication enough, a statement that they were alive, that they had survived, that they would continue to survive. Outside, the city settled into silence. The plague had quieted it. The plague had killed so many people that the normal sounds of urban life had been reduced to a kind of eerie quiet. But slowly, day by day, sounds were returning. People were returning. Life was returning, in its slow, painful, complicated way. The first market day after the Black Death had ended. But the story of the plague's aftermath was only beginning. The real work of rebuilding, of reimagining, of reconstructing the world, all of that lay ahead. It would take years. It would take decades. It would reshape society in ways that no one could have predicted. The plague would be remembered. The plague would be studied. The plague would become a reference point against which all future suffering would be measured. Was it as bad as the plague? People would ask in future centuries. And the answer would always be no. Nothing would ever be quite as bad as the plague. But for now, in this moment, in this first marketplace after the worst had passed, there was a simple fact. The marketplace was open. People were trading. Goods were being exchanged. The world was trying, however haltingly, to go on.